Coleman Hughes is one of the world's most incisive new commentators on racial politics. But not everybody likes what he has to say. He argues that America should still dream of being colorblind.
If you care about fighting racism, embrace colorblindness. Support class-based policies. Create colorblind processes in your own world.
Just as Martin Luther King did. So why do the critics say he's radical, even racist? Well, Coleman Hughes is here and he's uncensored. Coleman, great to have you on Uncensored. Let's get to that first question. Why do people think you're a racist?
Well, there's been a very effective campaign against the concept of colorblindness going back 50 years, but particularly in the last 10. Obviously, if you actually look at the historical record, the most important anti-slavery activists from the Civil War on through the Civil Rights Movement were committed to the idea that race doesn't matter, that race has no place in American law, and that in Martin Luther King's case, as he spelled out in his book, Why We Can't Wait, that the way we should address the legacy of slavery and racial inequality is through class-based anti-poverty programs that benefit the black poor and white poor alike. Now, that's my philosophy. The problem is there was an academic movement called critical race theory in the 80s and 90s that defined itself in opposition to the colorblind principle, that said the civil rights movement did not go far enough and that race has to be put on the front burner. American society is inherently racist, and the only way to do that is to center race in our own psychology and in public policy. And unfortunately, too many people have fallen for the myth that color blindness is naive at best or racist at worst. And I'll say one more thing about this. I think defenders of colorblindness, who I agree with, have given critics too easy a target by trotting out this line, "I don't see color." Obviously, we see color, right? We see race. We're all capable of being racially biased. So I think that's given critics too easy a target. We should ditch that phrase and say what we really mean, which is, I try to treat people without regard to their race, and I want to see that enshrined in public policy as well.
It's fascinating, the kickback that you face, because I watched you on Bill Maher last week and thought you just made so much sense. And you weren't being inflammatory, you weren't using incendiary rhetoric. You were just basically going back to what Martin Luther King said. You want people to be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin.
Absolutely. I mean, there's, in particular in elite institutions, and this is why I face some problems giving my TED Talk, elite institutions in particular have really lost themselves to this ideology that treats colorblindness as somehow akin to fascism almost. They've also come under the rhetoric of kind of safetyism, so that certain people will say that I've made them feel unsafe. Now, I don't know how you and your audience experience me right now, but I'm a pretty mild-mannered person.
I feel pretty safe, Coleman. I got to be honest with you. I don't feel under immediate threat.
Good, I'm glad. And so I try to have conversations with people, and I'm trying to, the truth is, outside of elite spaces, the kinds of arguments I make are almost boring to people because they're such common sense. And I think it spells out the difference between elites and everyone else, that the kinds of things I'm saying are experienced in certain elite spaces as harmful.
There's been this huge debate about diversity, equity and inclusion, DEI hiring, a big public clash between Elon Musk and Mark Cuban. Musk claiming that DEI was just another word for racism. This followed the resignation of Harvard's first black president, Claudine Gay. But Mark Cuban hit back and said, by extending our hiring search to include them, we find that people are more qualified. The loss of DEI-phobic companies is my gain. What did you make of that debate?
They actually both made true points. So the benign version of DEI, what you might call the older version of DEI, is exactly what Mark Cuban said. It's, I'm hiring for a position. I'm going to cast the net a little wider than I might otherwise do to make sure that I'm including in my in my search candidates that might not otherwise be included just by looking at my immediate network, right? That's actually really what was meant by affirmative action when the concept first came out in the 60s. Now that morphed into a very different concept, which is I'm going to abandon merit and make sure that this particular position is filled by a person of color, right? So if we're talking about the older benign version of DEI that preserves the merit principle, I'm all for that. The problem is that DEI, as it generally operates increasingly, and certainly in a post-2020 world, is more and more the second thing. It is making sure that my company has a certain number, essentially, or if not a specific quota, then a vague goal of having this many people of color, this many women, et cetera. And that is a violation of the merit principle. Now, part of the reason that people that were so confused about this is because American law is actually very confusing. And this is one thing that came up in their debate where they both have good points. The letter of civil rights law is colorblind. And that was absolutely the intent of the Civil Rights Act, was never to make someone higher on the basis of race in any direction. But over the decades, judges and executive orders have interpreted those laws to de facto require employees to consider and take race into account, or else be vulnerable to disparate impact lawsuits. So truthfully, America is in the legal regime is in a schizophrenic state right now. And I think that we ought to go back to the old benign version of DEI that Mark Cuban is saying he supports, and actually make that the reality rather than the toxic version that is the norm right now.
It reminds me, Coleman, of the woke debate. If you go back to the 60s, when the word woke first started being used, actually predominantly in African-American music, it was intended to just mean a raised awareness of social and racial injustice, to which everybody would sign up to, pretty much. But what it's become a form of fascism of the like that people who say they're woke profess to detest.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's become something, it's become speech codes. It's become the death of due process. It's become cancel culture and so forth. The truth is we have all of these terms, right? Wokeness, CRT, DEI, social justice. All of these terms have operated on rotation in the national conversation in the past 10 years. But, fundamentally, what I try to do in my book is cut past all of these terms that we argue about and talk about the underlying philosophy. The underlying philosophy ought to be that, Piers, I can see you're a white person, you can see that I'm not, but at the end of the day, and racism is possible, racism exists, but at the end of the day, the goal has to be that I'm judging you based on who you are as Piers Morgan, and you're judging me based on who I am as Coleman Hughes. Right. And we want to raise the next generation of kids to understand that that is the only appropriate attitude to have towards racial identity, not this philosophy which says you and I can't understand each other because we're of different races. There
was an interesting moment actually on Bill Maher's show this week, and this followed the shooting at the Kansas City Super Bowl parade. And we know that two teenagers were charged over the shooting, but very little other detail was given about them, including their skin colour. And Ann Coulter, the conservative commentator, said this.
If it were a white man shooting, we'd know. Remember the crazy terrorist Muslims? That's when I first noticed, they're not telling us who it is. It's not a white male. The longer they go without telling you, it's not a white male.
What did you think of that?
So I saw the Associated Press report that the reason we don't know anything about the identity of the subjects in this case is because Missouri law is very strict around juvenile suspects. So I have no reason to disbelieve that. If Associated Press is right, then Ann Coulter is wrong in this case. So, but stepping back, I think her general point is true about how the media reports stories differently based on the race of the perpetrators and the race of the victims. So I can give you two quick examples. One was the Kyle Rittenhouse case, where a lot of people didn't know from the reporting that the people he shot, the 3 people he shot, the 2 people he killed, were all white, because articles would just omit that. They would include that Kyle Rittenhouse, comma, a white man, and then they would just list the names of the people he killed, where you'd be pretty sure that if he had shot black people, that would be front and center in the article. And the second from memory was the case of Jasmine Barnes, which was a young girl that was tragically killed while sitting in her car. And it was initially thought to be a white man that had killed her. And as a result, it had wall-to-wall media coverage for about a week, until the authorities realized, actually it was just another gang shooting where she was caught in the crossfire, and the perpetrator was a young black man, and all of a sudden, no one cared about the story anymore. So I think there is certainly a deeper truth to what Ann Coulter is saying, even if she is not right about this specific story.
I mean, it's interesting that I think you've been quoted as saying that white victims of police brutality don't make news. And I think to a large extent that is true. And the issue of racial bias in police shootings, for example, there's a clip from a Harvard professor, Roland Fryer, and he spoke about his study, which academics told him not to publish, when he said he didn't find any racial bias in police shootings. Let's take a look.
We didn't find any racial bias in police shootings. Now, that was really surprising to me because I expected to see it. I had 8 full-time RAs that it took to do this over nearly a year. When I found the surprising result, I hired 8 fresh ones and redid it. They came up with the same exact answer, and I thought it was robust. And I went to go give it, and my God, all hell broke loose. I had colleagues take me to the side and say, don't publish this. You'll ruin your career.
I mean, fascinating that Harvard, again, it all comes back to Harvard. I don't know what the hell's been going on at that place, but fascinating. This guy, as he said, he went to painstaking lengths to check and double check the research and reached a conclusion that just wasn't popular, and therefore he had to be attacked.
Absolutely. I mean, Roland would certainly want me to mention that paper found 2 things. It found that there was a racial difference in a black person's likelihood of being roughed up, essentially, pushed against a police car, say. But there was no racial difference. In fact, a small racial difference in the opposite direction in terms of a black person's likelihood of being shot. Now, a lot of research has found that, but because of the hysteria and the culture of the conversation around police shootings during the Black Lives Matter era and the George Floyd era, those kinds of findings could not get a fair hearing in the public conversation, even if you have an extremely accomplished black Harvard economist saying it, and that shows something is really broken in our conversation around racial inequality.
Yeah, I completely agree. What do you think of the wider debate that goes on, in which we constantly seek to rewrite history? You know, whether it's knocking down statues of people in Britain who had once employed slaves, but maybe also did amazing work in revitalising and rebuilding whole cities with schools and hospitals and so on. Thinking of Colston in Bristol. Or you're talking about people wanting to take down, you know, statues of great American presidents, because they too had a dodgy history of slave ownership. And then the issue that comes off the back of that about reparations for people today whose ancestors were slaves or were treated badly. And I want to play a clip from the MSNBC presenter Joy Reid here, where she talks about her own personal demand.
Barack Obama's 2 terms as president are your reparations. And Juneteenth, which you already celebrated anyway, is your reparations. And yet, you built this country. You literally, physically built this country. And yet, the attitude toward you from a lot of your peers and your fellow citizens is just shut up and be grateful.
Your response, Coleman?
If you want to pay reparations to people like my grandparents who are alive, who grew up under segregation and Jim Crow, by all means do so. And you can call it reparations, you can call it damages. They're doing this outside of Chicago to living victims, okay? Living people that can show that they were harmed by racist policies before the end of Jim Crow. There is no precedent in American history for paying reparations for instance, to me, because of slavery, which ended in 1865. Freed slaves should have been paid reparations at the time. That's one of the great injustices of American history. That doesn't mean that we should be paying people for things that happened to their sixth greats grandparents. Now, the problem with this attempt to rewrite history is that it's so clearly based on a kind of narrow and frankly self-hating worldview among Americans. The fact is that slavery was practiced on every inhabited continent, in basically every society for thousands and thousands of years. And only in the past 300 or 400 years did countries bit by bit and one by one begin to outlaw it. America, as a country that was founded on the principle of freedom, had a contradiction and a kind of hypocrisy that other countries didn't have, because other countries didn't even pretend or profess freedom, right? So people hold that against America, the fact that there was hypocrisy here. I very much view it the opposite. I would say between the old world where slavery was legal everywhere and the new world where we've banned it, everywhere on earth, there was bound to be a moment of awkward transition and hypocrisy in a country like America. That doesn't mean America is worse than the rest of the world. In fact, I think it makes it better in some way.
Just finally, your book, Colorblindness, The Arguments for a Colorblind America, an end of race politics, which I think is a lovely aspiration, but not happening anytime soon by the look of it. But what reaction have you had from other black Americans since you've gone on your publicity tour and people have heard you explain your position?
The reaction from black Americans has been as varied as the reaction from white Americans. The only difference is, in many cases, the black people that support my message don't always want to do so publicly, because there is a penalty paid in the black community if you are perceived as any kind of race traitor or so forth. I don't see myself as any kind of race traitor. In fact, there are certain things that have hurt the black community that it's only people like me that talk about. For instance, in 2020, America experienced the greatest increase in the homicide rate year over year in 100 years. That's according to the Pew Research Center. And that effect was concentrated in the black community. To me, there is nothing more of a betrayal than to not talk about things that harm the community because they are not in vogue. So I don't view myself as any kind of race traitor, and though certain loud voices in the black community would accuse me of that.
Coleman Hughes, fascinating to talk to you. What a breath of fresh air you are to a very toxic debate that's not going away anytime soon. I hope people read your book. I really do. It's been great to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Piers.